The lonely widow took in the stray cat, not knowing it would lead her to a new chance at love and family. Margaret Wells stood in her kitchen, watching raindrops race down the window pane while the kettle's whistle pierced the silence of her empty home. 3 years had passed since Richard's death, yet the house still felt too quiet, too spacious, too empty of all the little sounds that made a house feel lived in. The creaking of his favorite chair, the rustle of his newspaper, the soft humming he did while brushing his teeth. Outside, the November rain turned the fallen leaves into a soggy carpet across her backyard. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around her thin frame, feeling the chill that seemed to seep through the walls these days. At 62, she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of solitude: morning coffee with the crossword puzzle, afternoon walks when weather permitted, evenings with books she'd read before because familiar stories felt like old friends. Her daughter Melissa called twice a week from Seattle, conversations that were increasingly filled with gentle suggestions about senior communities and how it might be nice to be around people your own age, Mom. Margaret always changed the subject. This house held 40 years of memories. How could she leave the place where Richard had carried her over the threshold, where they'd raised their daughter, where he'd taken his last breath holding her hand? The kettle clicked off. Margaret poured hot water over a tea bag, watching the amber color bloom through the clear liquid. Another night, another cup of tea, another evening of silence. The sound was so faint she almost missed it, a soft scratching at the back door. Margaret froze, teacup halfway to her lips. There it was again, a little more insistent. Setting down her cup, she approached the door cautiously, peering through the window. A pair of luminous green eyes stared back at her from a bedraggled gray face. A cat, soaking wet, pitifully thin, with one ear slightly torn, sat on her back step, paws pressed against the door as if knocking. When it saw her looking, it let out a pathetic meow that seemed to ask, "Will you please let me in from this awful rain?" "Shoo!" Margaret said through the glass. "Go on now. I don't have anything for you." The cat didn't move. It just stared at her with those unblinking green eyes, water dripping from its whiskers. "I'm not a cat person," Margaret informed it, feeling slightly foolish for talking to a stray through the door. Richard had been allergic to cats, and they'd never had pets after discovering his condition early in their marriage. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain intensified. The cat pressed closer to the door, trembling visibly now. Margaret sighed, her resolve crumbling. "Just for tonight," she muttered, turning the lock. "Until the storm passes." The cat darted inside the moment the door opened wide enough, its wet fur brushing against Margaret's ankles. It left damp paw prints on her kitchen tile as it circled the room, sniffing cautiously at the unfamiliar territory. "You're soaked through," Margaret observed, reaching for a dish towel. She approached the cat carefully, expecting it to flee, but instead it stood still as she gently patted its wet fur. "You're nothing but skin and bones," she murmured, feeling ribs beneath the sodden coat. The cat looked up at her and meowed again, a sound that seemed to convey both gratitude and hunger. "I suppose you want something to eat?" Margaret opened her refrigerator, surveying the meager contents. "I don't have proper cat food, you know." She retrieved a carton of milk and some leftover roast chicken from Sunday's dinner, a meal she'd made out of habit, too much for one person. The cat watched intently as she tore the chicken into small pieces and poured a little milk into a saucer. When she set the makeshift meal on the floor, the animal approached cautiously, sniffed once, then began to eat with desperate enthusiasm. "Slow down," Margaret cautioned. "You'll make yourself sick." As if understanding, the cat paused, looked up at her, then resumed eating at a slightly more measured pace. Margaret sat at her kitchen table watching this unexpected visitor. The simple act of preparing food for another living creature felt strangely satisfying. When was the last time she'd done that? Melissa's visit at Christmas, nearly a year ago. "I suppose you have a name somewhere," Margaret said. The cat had no collar, but it seemed too well-mannered to have been born in the wild. "Someone must be missing you." The cat finished eating, delicately licked its paws, then approached Margaret and rubbed against her legs, purring loudly enough that she could feel the vibration through her slippers. "Well," she said, surprised at the sudden lump in her throat, "I guess you can stay in the garage tonight. There's an old blanket out there." But when Margaret prepared the makeshift bed in the garage, the cat stood in the doorway between the kitchen and garage, looking back and forth between Margaret and the blanket, with an expression that clearly said this arrangement was unacceptable. "Fine," Margaret relented, too tired to argue with a cat. "One night in the house? just until the storm passes. That night, for the first time since Richard died, Margaret slept with another heartbeat in the house. The cat curled at the foot of her bed, a warm, comforting presence in the darkness. She slept more soundly than she had in months. Morning brought weak sunshine and the surprising realization that she had overslept. Usually awake before 6, Margaret found herself blinking at the clock that read 7:45. The cat was no longer on the bed, and for a moment she wondered if she'd dreamed the whole encounter. Then she heard a soft thump from the kitchen. Margaret found the cat sitting on her windowsill, watching birds at the feeder Richard had hung years ago. She'd kept it filled, enjoying the flashes of color against the monotony of her days. "I suppose you're hungry again," she said. The cat turned to look at her, then jumped down and patted over, weaving between her ankles. Its fur had dried overnight into a soft, plush coat of silver gray. "We should see if anyone's looking for you," Margaret said as she prepared breakfast for them both. "After we eat?" She called the local animal shelter while sipping her morning coffee. No one had reported a missing gray cat with green eyes and a notched ear. The woman on the phone asked if Margaret wanted to bring the stray in. "They're quite full this time of year," the woman added when Margaret hesitated. "If no one claims it within a week, well..." She didn't finish the sentence. Margaret looked at the cat, now curled comfortably on a chair opposite her. "I'll keep checking," she said and hung up. 3 days passed. Margaret put up notices at the local grocery store and the community center. She even created a simple found cat poster at the library's public computer, something she'd never done before. The librarian, a kind-faced woman named Helen whom Margaret knew from her weekly visits, helped her with the printing. "I didn't know you had pets, Margaret," Helen said, her eyes warm with interest. "I don't," Margaret replied automatically, then corrected herself. "I mean, it's not really mine. I'm just looking after it until the owner is found." Helen smiled. "Well, they say cats choose their people, not the other way around. Maybe you've been chosen." Margaret dismissed the notion with a small shake of her head, but later that evening, as she sat reading in her armchair with the cat curled contentedly in her lap, the words came back to her. The animal had settled into her routine with surprising ease, as if it had always belonged there. It slept on her bed each night, greeted her with soft meows each morning, and kept her company as she moved through her day. "I should give you a name," she mused aloud, stroking the silky fur. "Just temporarily, of course." The cat purred louder, kneading Margaret's lap with gentle paws. "How about Gracie? You're gray, and you came to me through the grace of that storm." The name felt right as soon as she spoke it. "Gracie it is, then." A week passed with no response to her notices. Margaret found herself buying proper cat food, a small bed, which Gracie ignored, preferring Margaret's, and even a few toys. The jingle of a small bell ball rolling across her hardwood floors became a familiar sound in the once silent house. 2 weeks after Gracie's arrival, Margaret realized she hadn't thought about senior living communities or felt the pressing weight of emptiness in days. Her house felt alive again. On a crisp Saturday morning, Margaret decided to take Gracie to the vet to check for a microchip and get proper vaccinations, just to be responsible, she told herself, not wanting to admit she was beginning to hope no one would claim this creature who had so unexpectedly filled a void in her life. The waiting room at Oak Ridge Veterinary Clinic was busy with Saturday morning appointments. Margaret sat with Gracie secure in a carrier borrowed from a neighbor, feeling oddly nervous. What if Gracie did have a chip? What if someone had been searching desperately for their beloved pet? First time here? The question came from a man sitting in the chair next to hers. Margaret guessed him to be about her age, perhaps a bit older, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes," Margaret admitted. "I've never had a pet before." "Ah," he smiled, glancing at the carrier where Gracie sat calmly observing her surroundings. "New addition to the family? Not exactly. She showed up at my door during that big storm a few weeks ago. I'm just getting her checked for a microchip, making sure she's healthy." "Good thinking. I'm James, by the way. James Finley." He offered his hand. "Margaret Wells." His handshake was warm and firm. "And who's your friend?" James nodded toward the carrier. "This is Gracie." The name slipped out naturally, as if the cat had always been Gracie, had always been hers. "Beautiful cat. I have two myself, rescues. That's Thor over there." He pointed to a carrier on the floor beside him containing an enormous orange tabby. Bit of an escape artist. Managed to get out yesterday and scraped his paw on something. Margaret found herself chatting easily with James while they waited. He was a retired high school English teacher who had moved to the area 5 years ago to be closer to his son and grandchildren after his wife passed away. "It gets easier," he said gently when Margaret mentioned her own widowhood. "Different, but easier. Thor and Loki, my other cat, they helped more than I can say." "Margaret Wells?" A vet technician called from the doorway. "That's me." Margaret stood gathering Gracie's carrier. "It was nice meeting you, Margaret," James said. "Maybe I'll see you around town." Something made her pause. "Do you ever go to the Riverside Cafe? For coffee, I mean?" "Every Tuesday and Thursday morning," he replied with a smile. "Best scones in town." "I've heard that," Margaret said, though she'd never been there herself. "Maybe I'll try them sometime." The examination revealed Gracie had no microchip. The vet, Dr. Chen, estimated her to be about 3 years old, and apart from being slightly underweight, in good health. "She's bonded with you, Doctor," Chen observed as Gracie nuzzled Margaret's hand during the examination. "Cats are good judges of character." Margaret left with a schedule of vaccinations, recommendations for care, and the strangely liberating knowledge that Gracie was officially hers now, or perhaps more accurately, she was Gracie's. The following Tuesday, Margaret found herself standing outside the Riverside Cafe, her heart fluttering with an unfamiliar nervousness. She hadn't been on anything resembling a date in over 40 years. This wasn't even a date, just coffee at a place where James Finley might happen to be. She almost turned back twice before finally pushing open the door. The cafe was warm and inviting, with the rich aroma of coffee and freshly baked goods. Margaret scanned the room, her eyes finding James almost immediately. He sat at a small table by the window, reading a paperback book. Thor and Loki were nowhere to be seen, of course. This wasn't an outing for pets. For a moment, Margaret considered leaving before he noticed her. This was silly, wasn't it? A woman her age, seeking out a stranger she'd met once at a vet's office? As if sensing her presence, James looked up. His face brightened with recognition and he waved her over. "Margaret, you came." The pleasure in his voice was genuine. "I'd hoped you might." "I heard the scones were good," she said, settling into the chair he pulled out for her. "The best," he confirmed with a warm smile. "Though the company today might be even better." Margaret felt a blush rise to her cheeks, something that hadn't happened in decades. What followed was the most enjoyable morning she'd had in years, conversation that flowed easily from books to music to their shared experiences of grief and rebuilding. James was intelligent, kind, and possessed a gentle humor that made Margaret laugh openly for the first time in too long. When they finally parted 3 hours later, they had plans to meet again on Thursday. And when Thursday came, they made plans for Sunday, a walk in the park with a picnic lunch that James offered to prepare. "Nothing fancy?" he assured her. "But I make a decent sandwich." Life developed a new rhythm. Coffee with James twice a week. Sunday outings that gradually extended into dinner at his home or hers. Margaret found herself looking forward to these times, planning what to wear, thinking of stories to share with him. One evening in late January, as they sat in Margaret's living room with Gracie curled contentedly between them on the sofa, James reached over and took Margaret's hand. "I never expected this," he said softly. "After Eleanor died, I thought that part of my life was over." Margaret's heart quickened. "I know. After Richard, well, I just assumed I'd be alone. And then a cat showed up at your door." James smiled, stroking Gracie with his free hand. The cat purred loudly, eyes half closed in bliss. "And led me to you," Margaret finished, finally understanding the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Margaret Wells," James said, his voice steady but vulnerable. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when something beautiful and unexpected happens after you've stopped believing in such possibilities. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered back. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, the kiss of two people who had loved deeply before and were brave enough to risk loving again. Spring arrived with a burst of new beginnings. Margaret's daughter Melissa flew in from Seattle for a visit, bringing her husband and their 2 children. The house that had seemed too quiet now rang with the laughter of her grandchildren as they chased Gracie through the rooms. "I've never seen you so happy, Mom," Melissa said one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching James play catch with the children in the backyard. Gracie supervised from her perch on the garden wall, tail twitching with interest. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Margaret admitted. After your father died, I just existed. And now? Margaret smiled, watching as her 7-year-old granddaughter squealed with delight when James lifted her onto his shoulders. Now I'm living again. I'm glad you didn't listen to me about that senior community, Melissa said, squeezing her mother's hand. This is where you belong. On a perfect evening in May, exactly 6 months after a bedraggled Gracie had appeared at her door, Margaret stood in her garden surrounded by the people she loved most in the world. James had arranged everything, a small gathering with Melissa's family, his son David and family, and their closest friends. In the golden light of sunset, with Gracie wearing a tiny bow tie collar for the occasion, James's idea, which had made Margaret laugh until she cried, they exchanged simple vows beneath the arbor Richard had built years ago. Love comes in many forms, James said, holding both Margaret's hands in his. Sometimes it arrives when we least expect it, as a second chance we didn't know to hope for. Sometimes, Margaret replied, her voice steady with certainty, it scratches at our door on a rainy night, asking to be let in. Their small assembled family applauded as they sealed their vows with a kiss. Gracie, seemingly aware of her role in this union, wound herself around their ankles, purring loudly enough for everyone to hear. Later that night, as Margaret and James sat on the porch swing of what was now their home, Gracie sprawled contentedly across both their laps. Margaret thought about the strange, beautiful journey that had brought her here. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked, leaning her head against James's shoulder. He considered the question, his hand never stopping its gentle stroke along Gracie's back. "I believe in second chances," he said finally. "And I believe that love finds us when we're ready for it, even when we think we're not." Margaret nodded, watching fireflies begin to spark in the gathering dusk. The loneliness that had seemed permanent just months ago now felt like a distant memory. Her home was filled with warmth again, with love, with family, with the possibility of many more years of happiness she hadn't dared to imagine. And it had all begun with a stray cat and an act of kindness on a rainy night. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, not sure if she was speaking to Gracie, to James, or to whatever force had guided this remarkable chain of events. James kissed her temple softly. "For what? For helping me remember that life isn't over until we decide it is. That love is always possible." Gracie stretched languidly across their laps, blinking slowly up at them both, a gesture cat lovers know as a kiss, a sign of complete trust and affection. Margaret stroked the soft fur behind her ears, feeling the rumble of contented purrs against her palm. The lonely widow who took in a stray cat not knowing where it would lead had found her way to joy again, to love, to family, to the beautiful understanding that even the darkest nights can lead to the brightest dawns, and that sometimes salvation comes on 4 paws with bright green eyes and a heart as big as the sky.